Welcome everyone to another live stream here offered at Empty Cloud Monastery, coming to you live on Friday morning. And today we will be discussing another sutta related to some previous sutta talks that we've given on this channel. Just recently here talked about the shorter discourse on emptiness, the Mahāsuññatasutta, and that is Majjhima Nikāya 121. And today the plan is to discuss or begin discussing the greater discourse on emptiness, the longer discourse on emptiness, the Mahāsuññatasutta, and that is Majjhima Nikāya 122. So it's a discourse following from the previous one that we talked about. And so whether or not you've seen those videos, that's okay. This discourse will, of course, have plenty to offer us. But if you have, then that will give you a little bit of context for those. And so hello to anyone who might be joining in live, and hello to anyone who might be watching this video later on. I will begin by rendering homage to the Buddha, to our original teacher. He's the reason why we have the opportunity to gather here, to read his discourses and his encounters, to learn from his teachings and try to apply those to our lives and bring them into our hearts. And so we will begin by the traditional rendering of homage to the Buddha. And then I will go ahead and begin reading our sutta, begin reading the discourse, offering some commentary, some thoughts and reflections. And then if you have any questions about what's being read or about practice related directly to the sutta, then feel free to leave that in the chat bar. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ Dhammaṃ Sanghaṃ Saraṇaṃ Gacchāmi. Okay, so let's begin looking at our sutta. As I mentioned, this is the longer discourse on emptiness, the Mahāsuññatasutta, Majjhima Nikāya 121. So I have heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying in the land of the Sakyans, near Kapilavatthu, in the banyan tree monastery. Then the Buddha robed up in the morning, and taking his bowl and robe, entered Kapilavatthu for alms. He wandered for alms in Kapilavatthu. After the meal, on his return from alms round, he went to the lodge of the Sakyan Khemaka the Dark for the day's meditation. Now at that time, many resting places had been spread out at the lodge of Khemaka the Dark. The Buddha saw this and wondered. Many resting places have been spread out. Are there many mendicants living here? Now at that time, Venerable Ananda, together with many other mendicants, was making robes at the lodge of the Sakyan Vaḍḍha. Then in the late afternoon, the Buddha came out of retreat and went to Vaḍḍha's lodge, where he sat on the seat spread out, and said to Venerable Ananda, Many resting places have been spread out at the lodge of Khemaka the Dark. Are many mendicants living there? Indeed, there are, sir. It's currently the time for making robes. And so this is our setting. This is the beginning of our sutta. And there's some interesting details just about the life of the Sangha, the life of the monastics at this time here that you can see, right? So of course, the Buddha and us, monks who follow the precepts set down by the Buddha, we are alms mendicants, meaning that we are, bhikkhu and bhikkhuni. Bhikkhu means someone who goes for bhikkhā. Bhikkhā means alms. So receiving the food which is offered to us, right? So every morning at the monastery, if we are lucky, if we are fortunate, if someone decides to be generous and kind and open up their heart, then we will eat that day. And if someone decides that, if no one is able to come, then we will not eat that day. And likewise, sometimes we go into town and we do alms round. So we go in and bring our bowls, and we find places to stand, and then we receive whatever is offered to us, which is edible, which is allowable. So, we don't receive money, we don't use money, we don't buy food, we don't prepare food in the ground, we don't, pick and choose really what people offer us, unless there's, on some rare occasions, then generally speaking, we're just getting whatever people bring, as long as it's allowable, that's what we're eating. And we eat, our substantial meals only until noon, until midday, till solar noon. And so the Buddha followed that practice, as we still continue to follow to this day. And so he's staying in the land of the Sakyans near Kapilavatthu. And you might remember that the Buddha himself was a Sakyan. So this is the Buddha's hometown, his home region, Kapilavatthu being the capital city, the capital town of the Sakyan Republic, right? So if you are from, maybe you're from a state in the United States and you know the capital city of that, right? Or if you're from a province or a region in another country, you know that there's a capital city usually in every region, every province. And so Kapilavatthu is the capital of this particular region, the Buddha's home region. And so he's at what's called the Banyan Tree Monastery, the Nigrodharama, right? So this is a kind of, what we call an arama is basically means a park, right? Nowadays we have the word ashram, which is actually the English word of the same Pali word. But it's a park. And so you would have had parks which were kind of like tailored and selected plants and vegetation, kind of natural areas where they would be donated to, for example, the Buddhist monastics for them to live there. So it's not quite the same as living in a forest hut. It's actually kind of like a tailored, a kind of park, which is designed for people living there. And you would have then, monastery buildings. So you might have, in other places, the Buddha mentions at Savatthi, I believe that's where they have a stilt longhouse of Migara's mother. So probably like a relatively large longhouse gathering building, which was in the monastery. And then you also have lodging buildings and kuttis, and you might have had other places. And so this is a kind of monastery, what we would now call a monastery, which is why Bhante Sujato translates this as the Banyan Tree Monastery. So it's in a park, but it would have particular buildings and so on. It's not quite the same as living in a secluded forest hut. And so the Buddha is staying in one of these monasteries. He's staying in one of these kind of like a forest monastery. And he robes up in the morning, means he puts on his robe. He takes his bowl and his robe and he enters Kapilavatthu for alms. And then after the meal, after he got his alms food, he returned and he went to the lodge of the Sakyan Khemaka, the dark. So here it seems that the lodge of Khemaka the dark, the Sakyan Khemaka the dark, would have been some kind of building, some kind of place for practicing meditation, for sleeping and so on, that was donated by the Sakyan Khemaka the dark. So for example, like I mentioned, you might have had this park here, and within the park, you would have had different pieces of property. So I mentioned that Savatthi, in the monastery at Savatthi, unless I'm mixing up the monasteries, but I believe it's Savatthi. It was in the last sutta, in the lesser discourse on emptiness, the shorter discourse on emptiness. The Buddha was staying in the stilt longhouse of Migada's mother. So it's called that because Migada's mother would have donated that longhouse. She would have donated the house. So there's particular in the, you have the park itself, so you have the land itself, but then within the land you also have you have buildings, monastery property, and so those would often be donated by lay people, it seems. And this one, there's at the monastery outside of Kapilavatthu, it seems that there was a building, a kind of lodging place, offered by a Sakyan named Khemaka the Dark. And so the Buddha went to stay there. He went to stay for the day after his alms round. And he noticed that many resting places had been set out at that place. So again, this indicates that this would have been a place where people would be sleeping, right? So a resting place means that you would have basically people's sleeping mats, right? So maybe you have the sleeping mats there. And so the Buddha is seeing like, oh, kind of like a dorm room, right? If you walk into the dorm room and you see, oh, there's many sleeping places out. So that means that probably people are staying there. So it would have been some kind of building, it might have been, I don't know exactly how open or what it would have looked like, but it looks like there were people staying there. And so the Buddha saw this and he was wondering, many resting places have been spread out. Are there many mendicants living here? Right? So the beds have been laid out. There's resting spots all over the hall. And so he's thinking, are there a lot of people living here right now? Right. And you notice that that's interesting because the Buddha wasn't necessarily aware that there were a lot of people there. Right. So he might have just arrived. He might have been wandering, and then he came to this particular monastery, and then he noticed, oh, there's a lot of people out. Or maybe he was away for a few days, so we'll see about that. But the Buddha is noticing, oh, there's a lot of people, there's a lot of beds. I wonder if there's a lot of people in the monastery. Now at that time, Venerable Ananda, together with many other mendicants, was making robes at the lodge of the Sakyan Vaḍḍha. So here we have another lodging, right? Another place which has been offered by a Sakya named Vaḍḍha. And it seems that Vaḍḍha was probably a woman. So we have Khemaka would have been Sakyan, and then we have another place offered by Vaḍḍha. So you see that property was offered by both men and women, right? Just like Migada's mother had offered the longhouse. So both men and women offered property. And you see that in the suttas. You see both male and female lay disciples of the Buddha using their wealth and so on to offer property to the Sangha. And so Venerable Ananda is with many other monks, and they're making robes. And in the late afternoon, the Buddha came out of retreat and went to Vaḍḍha's lodge, where he sat on the seat spread out. So the Buddha came to where Ananda was, and he said, many resting places have been spread out at the lodge of Khemaka the Dark. Are many mendicants living there? And Ananda says, indeed there are, sir. It's currently the time for making robes. So this means that, why are there many people there? Well, because they're making robes with Ananda. And you might wonder, what is that? Well, in the Buddhist tradition, after the rainy season retreat, after the Vaḍḍha, then there is a time called the Katina season. So Katina is a time where the monks were allowed to make robes. So we're allowed to, for example, receive extra robe cloth, and we have kind of extra allowances for making robes, sewing and patching and making new ones. So, traditionally, robe cloth would not be easy to come by. Because remember, in those days, you would have had to weave the cloth. You can't just get synthetic cloths at a factory or something. It would have had to be woven. So cloth is not easy to come by in those times. And so it was very valuable. And also, in order to patch and mend and stitch robes and receive them and so on, often it would have been helpful to have what is like a robe, what's called a robe frame. That's actually what the katina means. Katina stands for a robe frame. So this would be like a frame where you could put the robe and kind of attach it and then easily mend it and work with it, right? And so if you are a wandering monk, you're wandering around, then most of the time, it's not going to be easy to come across robe cloth. And you also aren't necessarily going to have the tools, like the frame, to mend the cloth. And also, it's much easier to make cloth when you're working together in a group, because remember, they would have been sewing by hand. So sewing by hand, it takes a while. So if you have many people working together, like one person works on this part of the robe, the other person works on that part of the robe, then you can get it done quicker, especially if you have the frame. So the way that it would have worked is that often at these larger monasteries, like this is the Banyan Tree Monastery, right? So this is a monastery which, as I mentioned, it's near a major town, and it has property that's been donated, and it has space for many people to stay. So after the rainy season retreat being a 3-month period where Buddhist monks have to decide where they're going to stay, and they have to stay in that place, for the entire time, basically, with very few exceptions. So most of the time, Buddhist monks, we are itinerant, but at this time, for the rainy season retreat, we take a vow of stability for just the season that would be the monsoon season in India. So you see, that's the perfect time, because at that time, all the monks are going to be gathered together, or a lot of monks will be together, and the lay people will be able to offer robe cloth, so like they can save up, basically, if they want to offer, they can save up, and they know that at that particular time, all the monks are going to be together. So at that time, the lay people can offer the robes to the whole Sangha. Instead of like offering it to an individual monk, you can offer it to the whole Sangha, and then it can be distributed as needed, right? So some people will need some people will need more, some people will need less, some people won't need any. So at that time, the cloth that's been offered can be distributed, and then people can use the tools in the monastery, like the large frames, the sewing frames, and they can work together in groups and sew and mend their robes. So it's the perfect time, right, to do that. Otherwise, it's much more difficult to find the cloth, to work on the cloth, and so on. So after the rainy season, that's when the Buddha allowed this special time for working on robes. And we have a lot of rules on, not storing extra robe cloth and so on. So, we have rules on only having basically the minimum robes required, just our basic requisites, and not storing up a bunch of extra cloth that we're not really using. And so during this time, though, you're actually allowed to have extra cloth until a certain point, because that, you're using it to work on the robes. So that's the setting here, right? And then the Buddha launches in. So he's using this as a teaching opportunity. And he says, Ananda, a mendicant doesn't shine who enjoys company in groups, who loves them and likes to enjoy them. It is quite impossible that such a mendicant will get the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of awakening when they want, without trouble or difficulty. But you should expect that a mendicant who lives alone, withdrawn from the group, will get the pleasure of renunciation, the pleasure of seclusion, the pleasure of peace, the pleasure of awakening when they want, without trouble or difficulty. That is possible. Indeed, Ananda, it is quite impossible that a mendicant who enjoys company will enter and remain in the freedom of heart, either that which is temporary and pleasant, or that which is irreversible and unshakable. But it is possible that a mendicant who lives alone, withdrawn from the group, will enter and remain in the freedom of heart, either that which is temporary and pleasant, or that which is irreversible and unshakable. Okay, so the Buddha is saying, all these people are gathered together, right? So there's a bunch of monks, bhikkhus, possibly also bhikkhunis, bhikkhus, working on robes and gathered all together. And the Buddha is saying, you really should not be enjoying the company of groups, right? Because he's saying, when you're socializing, when you are enjoying groups, when you are enjoying socializing, you like them and you enjoy them, it's impossible that you'll get the pleasure of renunciation, seclusion, peace, and awakening when you want, without trouble or difficulty. What does that mean? What is that pleasure that the Buddha is talking about? He's saying that someone who enjoys company, who enjoys socializing, someone who loves and likes being in groups, they won't be able to attain the jhanas when they want, without trouble and difficulty. And they won't be able to attain awakening. But someone who lives alone, withdrawn from the group, it is possible for them to get the pleasure of the jhanas and of the awakening. And so then the Buddha is just specifying here the pleasure of renunciation, seclusion, peace, and awakening. That can refer to two things. One thing is that which is temporary and pleasant, meaning the Buddha is referring to the jhanas. And the other thing that can refer to is that the freedom of heart, which is irreversible and unshakable, meaning arahantship, right? Someone who attains arahantship, someone who becomes fully awakened. So there are seclusion from temporary seclusion, and there's complete irreversible seclusion, right? Seclusion from the defilements, seclusion from attachment, seclusion from ignorance and craving. So when we socialize, when we love groups and socializing, our mind is sent out. Our mind enjoys the company. It finds peace, it finds happiness, it finds safety being with others, not being alone. It finds happiness and stimulation from external impressions, not from the mind finding peace from an inner source. So we are training our mind. We are fueling and feeding, nourishing our mind with particular pleasures, right? Either the pleasure of groups, company, talking, socializing, being together, or the pleasure of being alone. It can only be one of those two. So the Buddha is saying it's not possible for someone to enjoy the pleasure of seclusion, meaning they can't attain the jhanas and they can't attain awakening, because in order to do that, in order to attain the jhanas, you have to be completely secluded from sensual pleasures, which includes people, includes socializing. You have to be completely secluded from the desire to engage in the senses. Excuse me. You have to be completely secluded from any interest, any restlessness, any kind of interest in the outside world. And to attain awakening, even more so. Even more so, your mind must be free of any desire to socialize, desire to be with others, desire not to be alone, desire to be engaged in chatting and talking. So we have to learn, can we learn to be alone? Can we learn the peace that comes from being alone? For many people, that sounds depressing. For many people, being alone, not socializing, sounds lonely. But the Buddha said that actually being alone can be blissful. It can be peaceful. It can be amazing. You can shine, right? He says someone doesn't shine who enjoys those things. So can we make our mind happy to be inside? Can we collect the energies of our mind? Can we collect the dispersal of the mind mind which wants to feed and run out and jump at the different pleasures of, social pressures, societal expectations, wanting to prove ourselves, wanting to be someone, wanting to say something, wanting to distract ourselves with company, right? Well, when we're alone, we don't have that possibility. The only thing we have is either we suffer or we have to learn how to be alone, how to be happy alone, how to feed the mind without dependency, right? And so the Buddha is saying that if you're enjoying company, you'll never actually learn how to do that. You'll never actually learn how to be alone in a happy, peaceful, blissful state. So we have to learn how to be alone. And in order to do that, the first step is withdrawing, right? Taking that time to be by ourselves. So you can look and see, do you spend time alone? And it's important to stress that nowadays, alone does not mean, being in your room on your phone, using social media, using entertainment, using some other kind of distraction. That is being in company. So being alone means, just you and your mind, just your mind and your body, just the khandhas, just the aggregates, just yourself. So it doesn't mean distractions, right? So using social media, using entertainments, using, these types of things, that is still finding company. It's just using it in an alternative way, right? Remembering that in ancient India in those times, if you didn't, if you weren't around other people, there's no books, there's no newspaper, there's no social media, there's no YouTube, there's no Netflix, there's no, music apps, there is no TV, there's no radio. So, not even a book, let alone a radio, let alone a TV, let alone a smartphone, let alone some other more advanced technology. So being alone means being alone. So can we be alone, right? We have to ask ourselves that question. And we have to train our mind that our mind thinks that happiness is to be found out. It's to be found fixating on characteristics. Our mind thinks that sending itself out and enjoying, delighting, feeding on these things, distracting ourselves, not looking inward, we think that that's actually happier, right? But actually, we have to train our mind that is a stressful process. The mind going out, the mind attaching, the mind getting involved, it's much more stressful, much more complicated, much more distracting, right? Actually having attention, having interest, having stillness, having peace, not moving the mind, it's more natural, it's more peaceful, it's more easeful. There's more interest and focus there, so it's better. But we have to train our mind to find that peace. So when we don't like being alone, it's not that we don't like being alone. It's that we don't like our mind pulling us, pushing us, pressuring us, right? So actually being alone is perfectly peaceful. The problem is when we want to be in a group, the pain of the mind wanting to be somewhere else. That's the problem, right? So if we think that being alone is scary, being alone is lonely, being alone is painful, being alone is boring, being alone is anxiety-inducing, actually being alone is none of those things. The problem is the mind which wants to be somewhere else. The problem is the impulses of the mind. It's the ignorance of the mind, which thinks happiness is elsewhere. It's the craving of the mind, which tells itself that it's lacking, that it needs something else. It's the grasping of the mind, which wants to hold on to something and grab and move itself, right? So it's actually the defilements which are painful. It's the defilements which are irritating. It's the defilements which are anxiety-inducing. It is not the being alone. If we were truly alone, if we were truly secluded, if our mind was truly at peace with itself, it would not be lonely. It would not be painful. It would be peaceful. It would be blissful. It would lead to awakening. It would lead to wisdom, right? So we have to remember that. We have to remind ourselves that the problem is not the external scenario. The problem is not the lack of company. The problem is the defilements which trick us, right? The tyrants which rule our mind, which tell us, we need to go there, we need to do this. They order us around, and we feel that we must obey them. We feel that we must follow them. We feel that we must listen and bend ourselves to them, otherwise we'll suffer. Actually, we will not. Suffering comes from that needing to listen to these defilements, right? Needing to follow our impulses, our cravings, our desires, our aversions, our distractions, our greed, hatred, and delusion, right? So that is not where happiness comes from. But our defilements, they sure want to tell us that's where it comes from, right? They want us to believe that that's where it comes from. They want us to think, because, they get happiness out of these things, but we do not. We just suffer. We become more and more dependent, less fulfilled in ourselves, right? So needing company means that we're not happy. It means that we're not fulfilled. It means that we're empty inside. And if it was up to craving, we would be as empty can be. We would be never full, never satisfied, because craving is hunger. Hunger and full, hunger and being content, right? Thirst and being satiated, quenched, they can't coexist. So you can't be full and hungry. Either you're hungry or you're full. So if we have craving, we're never full. We're never fulfilled. We're never contented. We're never satisfied. If we reduce the craving, if we train ourselves that craving is the problem, that craving is the cause of our problems, then we will be full. Because if you don't have hunger, you're full. If you remove your thirst, you're quenched. So there's a dichotomy there. There's no need to add anything extra. Remove the craving and you're already satisfied. Remove the ignorance and you already know. So we just have to train ourselves. How can we train ourselves in this way, right? How can we learn not to suffer when we're alone, right? And the way to do it is to look in our hearts and to see, wow, my mind is pulling me. And see, I don't need to follow that, actually. Right? I can just observe that movement. We can just learn to observe that. We can learn not to follow it. So we have to train ourselves, and we have to have patience. It will not always be easy. We have to have some faith. We have to have some interest and enthusiasm. Otherwise, it'll be difficult and we'll give up. So we have to have that faith, that confidence, that interest, that enthusiasm to apply ourselves to this practice. But actually, it can be very interesting, right? You can start to investigate and see the mind which wants to go out. And then the Buddha says, Ananda, I do not see even a single sight which, when it decays and perishes, would not give rise to sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and distress in someone who has desire and passion for it. But this meditation has been understood by the realized one, namely, to enter and remain in emptiness internally by not focusing on any signs. Okay, so what is this? So we just talked about this, actually, right? So the Buddha is saying that someone who has desire, who has passion, who has interest and enthusiasm for external sights, external forms, basically external objects, external things. If our mind is fixated, attached, nourished, bounded by, right, those things, passionate for those things, liking and desiring after these external things, then the Buddha says there's not a single one which won't cause sadness when it fades, won't cause pain when it perishes. It won't cause sorrow, lamentation, distress to someone who has desire and lust, right? So no matter what it is, big or small, high or low, sublime or coarse, right? Internal, external. It doesn't matter what it is. Any kind of thing outside, any kind of form, any kind of sight, any kind of object, all of that, when it fades, when it perishes, when it goes away, when we don't have access to it anymore, it's going to cause sorrow, sadness, lamenting, grieving, distress, pain, agony, anxiety. Because with the attachment, then our mind loses something it loves, right? So it's kind of like if you're leaning against a door and then someone opens the door and you fall back, it's impossible that you won't fall, right? If you're leaning against something, when it's taken out from under you, you're going to fall. If you're standing on something and the thing you're standing on gets taken away, you're going to fall. And it's going to be painful. It's going to hurt because you were depending on that, right? So it's the same with the people in our life, right? If we are depending on being with people, depending on socializing, then when those people are gone, either temporarily, or they die, or we die, or they get sick, we are going to be, it's impossible that we won't be sad, that we won't be distressed, that we won't be upset. It's impossible because we were leaning on them. We were depending on them. Our mind was fixating on them. It was resting there. And it's the same with any kind of other distraction, any kind of external dependency. If we distract ourselves with entertainments, if we distract ourselves with homes, if we distract ourselves with responsibilities and duties and work, whatever it is, as soon as that's gone, as soon as it perishes, as soon as it changes, as soon as it disappears and vanishes and fades away, we will be upset. We will be sad if we were desiring it, right? So the Buddha says he doesn't see a single form which wouldn't do that. But he says that he has realized, he has practiced, he has understood a meditation where by not focusing on any signs, someone can enter and remain in emptiness internally. So we just talked about this in the last sutta, and you kind of get the idea here, right? What is the idea? The idea is that if the mind removes itself from going out, from shooting out, from latching on, right? If the craving isn't driving and pulling the mind to pick up objects, to pick up characteristics, to pick up signs and features, to be attached and engaged in the outside world, right? If the mind can come within itself, if it can gather together and it can not send anything out, not pick up any outside characteristics, then it could enter into emptiness internally, right? Meaning it would be empty. It would not be full of anything inside. It would just be focusing on the emptiness, the absence, the lack, the aloneness, right? The withdrawal. And so that's a possibility. That's a form of meditation which can be developed by withdrawing your attention from outside things. And in the last sutta, in the shorter discourse on emptiness, the Buddha discussed how one could do that. Gradually withdrawing attention, gradually releasing the mind from fixating on external characteristics. And it culminated, the Buddha says that someone who practices that fully, it will culminate for them in the signless immersion of the heart, the animitta ceto samadhi, where they don't experience any signs. Their mind doesn't experience any characteristics, any features, doesn't construct any experience. So the Buddha is saying it's possible for someone to do that. And you can see how that would be actually a direct antidote to the mind which does fixate on characteristics. Right? Like, can you sit still and just withdraw your mind, release your mind from engaging in the characteristics of the room, of the body, of the environment? Can you enter into more and more emptiness? Can you empty your mind out more and more and more by actually withdrawing its kind of tentacles, right, that are engaged in the outside world, that are picking up the characteristics and signs? So learning to just let things be, let them go, let them fade, let them vanish. Then the Buddha has realized how someone can enter into the internal emptiness by not focusing on any outside signs, any features. And that type of meditation, it, as we mentioned last time, it's a little bit different from meditation where you focus your attention. This is a meditation, the emptiness meditation that the Buddha is describing. That's a meditation where you are actually supposed to be withdrawing your attention, right? So a very simple example, just like you might take an object, you might look at it, you see, can you withdraw your attention from it? And your mind will rest in a more base level state, a more natural state. Like if you withdraw your attention from the objects in the room, naturally the space will be left because the space is already there. The space is kind of behind the objects, right? So if you withdraw your attention from the objects, naturally there will be space. So you actually don't need to fixate on the space. You just kind of withdraw your attention from the objects and your mind will naturally pick up the characteristic of space. And then can you withdraw your mind from space and so on until eventually you withdraw your mind, you withdraw your attention, you withdraw your fixating, the focusing on any characteristic whatsoever. And you focus just on the absence of any characteristic. You focus just on the emptiness. So that's what the Buddha is describing here. He's saying that he's understood that meditation. And you can see how that would be an antidote to the mind which wants to pick up characteristics. And the Buddha says, now suppose that while the realized one is the Buddha, it's the Tathagata. Suppose that while the realized one is practicing that meditation, bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, laymen, laywomen, rulers and their chief ministers, monastics of other religions and their disciples go to visit him. In that case, with a mind slanting, sloping, and inclining to seclusion, withdrawn and loving renunciation, having totally eliminated his defiling influences, he invariably gives each of them a talk related to sending them away, related to dismissal, interested in sending them away. Okay, so what the Buddha is saying here is that while he's practicing that meditation, so basically if he is abiding in peaceful, secluded meditation, right, he's withdrawing his mind to a deep, profound state of emptiness where his mind doesn't pick up any characteristics at all. Like it doesn't perceive any forms, any things, any characteristics, even the formless ones. It doesn't even perceive the formless ones. So he's kind of like withdrawing his mind and focusing on internal emptiness almost, right? So that's a very deep state, right? So the Buddha, sometimes he would meditate like that. And he's saying that though sometimes when he's doing that, when he's practicing like that, you know, bhikkhus might come up to him, bhikkhunis might come up to him, laymen might come up to him, laywomen might come up to him, rulers and ministers might come up to him, monastics from other religions, right? Other spiritual people might come up to him, or their disciples. So many people might go to visit him, right? They might come to visit the Buddha. But his mind slants and slopes, inclines to seclusion. So his mind doesn't incline towards like enjoying company. Instead, his mind inclines towards being alone. His mind is withdrawn. His mind loves renunciation. So his mind loves to let go. You know, his mind loves to release things. It doesn't love to pick things up. It loves to let things be, not to get involved in things. So when people go and visit him, then he naturally gives them a talk about basically connected to sending them away, right? So that doesn't mean that he's like averse to them, but you know, there's two ways of talking to people when they visit you, right? You can kind of like, you want the conversation to keep going. So you kind of engage them. You kind of try to keep it going. Or you just say just enough to get them to go off, right? Not in an averse way, but like you say what they need to hear so that then they go off and practice on their own, right? So like the Buddha would, he would just say what he needs to say so that the person will then go off and practice. So not because he's averse to them being there, but because his mind inclines to being alone. And he understands that other people's minds have to incline that way as well if they want to let go of their attachments. So he can give them instructions, right? He can offer teachings, but he offers teachings which incline towards them, towards the teaching ending, right? He offers teachings which incline towards basically, now go off, now go and practice, go and be alone, right? Don't get caught up in engaging, don't get caught up in socializing, go and be alone. And the Buddha's mind inclines towards him being alone. And he teaches other people in a way which, the way that he teaches, it inclines people to not to stick around, not to listen, but to receive the instructions and then go off, right? So it's a way of teaching, right? Where the Buddha he's emphasizing just being alone. Like, you don't need to know much, just learn to be alone. That's a lot of what we need to do. So that's what the Buddha is saying here, that when his mind is like that, he doesn't incline towards kind of socializing. He inclines towards teaching people so that they will go off and practice on their own, go off and be alone. And then the Buddha says, therefore, if a mendicant should wish, may I enter and remain in emptiness internally, then they should still, settle, unify, and immerse their mind in samadhi internally. And how does a mendicant still, settle, unify, and immerse their mind in samadhi internally? It's when a mendicant, quite secluded from sensual pleasures, secluded from unskillful qualities, enters and remains in the first absorption, second absorption, third absorption, fourth absorption. That's how a mendicant stills, settles, unifies, and immerses their mind in samadhi internally. So, the Buddha is saying that if someone thinks, oh, I want to practice like that, I want to practice that emptiness meditation like the Buddha says, he's saying then they should practice the 4 jhanas. Right? He's saying that the 4 jhanas are bases, they are foundations, they are groundwork for developing emptiness. Why? Well, because as he says here, the first jhana is when someone becomes quite secluded from sensual pleasures and secluded from unskillful qualities. So remember that the Buddha is talking about how you need to develop seclusion. You need to develop a mind which wants to be alone, which enjoys being alone, which loves renunciation. Well, the first jhana, if you practice to attain the first jhana, you are practicing that quality. So if you can attain the first jhana, if you can attain the 4 jhanas, it'll be much easier for you to withdraw from all characteristics, all signs and features, all details. Withdraw your mind to focus on emptiness internally, right? So the Buddha is saying that the 4 jhanas are basically, deep, profound groundwork, which we should try to develop. We should try to establish ourselves. We should try to cultivate them, try to attain them, and try to be able to maintain them if we have attained them. Try to attain them if we haven't, and try to develop them, right? So we should use our practice to learn seclusion and develop a happiness which doesn't depend on sensual pleasures, doesn't depend on sights, happiness which doesn't depend on sounds, happiness which doesn't depend on tastes, happiness which doesn't depend on smells, happiness which doesn't depend on bodily sensations, happiness which doesn't depend on daydreaming about the past and future, speculating and getting caught up in opinions, liking and disliking. But instead, can we train our mind to develop a happiness which comes from just being still, just being content, just being alone? And so if someone does that, if they can immerse their mind in samadhi, then they focus on emptiness internally. So then they focus on emptiness, but their mind does not leap forth, does not gain confidence, settle down and become decided. So, they practice in that way. They practice to attain the jhanas, and then they try to focus on emptiness, but it doesn't work. So then they understand that they are focusing on emptiness internally, but their mind doesn't leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided. In this way, they are aware of the situation. So then the Buddha continues, I'll just continue. He says, they focus on emptiness externally, or they focus on emptiness internally and externally, or they focus on the imperturbable, but their mind does not leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided. So they understand that they're trying to focus on those things, but that their mind doesn't leap forth, gain confidence, settle down, and become decided in them. And in that way, they are aware of the situation. Right? So the idea being here that the person they try to develop samadhi, and then they try to use that samadhi as a basis to focus on emptiness, or what the Buddha calls the imperturbable. But it doesn't work. And so they should just be aware of that. Develop what the Buddha calls sampajanya, right? So they are aware. They're aware of what's happening, meaning that they're just noticing how their mind is picking up or not picking up the meditation, right? And this is a very important quality that we develop, right? We just develop an awareness of what's happening in our meditation, and we respond appropriately. We don't need to get upset. We don't need to get discouraged. Just develop awareness. Just notice what's happening and just respond, right? Just calm. It's okay. Just let it be and just respond as you need to. But it's important that we become aware. If we're just trying to hammer away at a meditation theme and it's not working, and we just keep hammering away until eventually we get tired and give up, well, we need to have the awareness to notice what is happening, right? Is it working? Is it not? What is working? What is not? What makes us peaceful? What doesn't? What makes us happy? What does not? So we have to have awareness of what's actually happening. We can't just be hammering away blindly, so to speak, right? So this is what the Buddha is pointing to, how someone needs to notice how their meditation is proceeding, have some awareness about what's happening inside of themselves. And he mentions how they might try to focus on emptiness internally. So they might try to let go of all signs internally. Or they might try to focus on emptiness externally, so trying to withdraw their mind from all external signs. Or they might try to focus on emptiness internally and externally. So they might try to withdraw their mind from all signs, whether internal or external. Or they might try to focus on the imperturbable, which refers to the formless attainment. So they might try to go from the fourth. If they've attained the fourth jhana, they might try to then attain the formless attainments of the dimension of infinite space, or the dimension of infinite consciousness. Possibly you could also include in that the other two formless attainments. So the idea is that the Buddha is saying first someone tries to develop the jhanas, and then from there, they might try to focus on some other more lofty meditation, like emptiness meditations or imperturbable meditations. But if it doesn't work, they have to be aware of that. They develop awareness of it. And so then they should, the Buddha says, then if it doesn't work and they're aware of it, they should still, settle, unify, and immerse their mind in samadhi internally, using the same meditation subject as a basis of immersion that they had used before. So basically, if it's not working, then they should go back to the previous level that they had used, stabilize and still their mind there. So basically, if you're trying to do something in meditation and it's not working, you should go back to a former level, a basis of meditation which does give you some kind of grounding. Even if that's just like, can you just be aware of what's happening? Can you just be aware of the thoughts and so on? So go back to the previous level and develop some kind of stability there. Once you have some kind of groundwork, then try to develop the next stage of meditation. If that doesn't work, you be aware of it. Don't keep trying and trying and trying and trying. Develop awareness and then go back and develop more of a foundation. That's what the Buddha is talking about. He's just talking about how someone would do that on a very advanced level. And so I think at this point we can stop, and we can, we'll have time later on to do the rest of this sutta. We'll be going over this on Wednesday. So next week we'll go over the rest of the sutta. But I hope that, those were some practical instructions from the Buddha there. And at this point we can close and respect this aspect of the sutta with 3 sadhus, which means excellent or wonderful. And then I'll look and see if there's any questions to address. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for your attention, and let's take a look here. So hello to some of the people joining in live. We had Anjali from Bhumika, Madeline, Maria, Rising, Jayanta, Isabel, Gregory, Manny, Mano, Amaranta, and Sud, and anyone else who might be joining in live. Hello to you. And we have a question from Manny who says, Bhante, this morning, Bhante stressed that Kalyanamitta is a factor for awakening. Is spiritual socialization okay? Also, how does the lone aspirant share his wisdom to others? Things. Okay, so yeah, talking about socializing in relation to having spiritual friendship, right? Well, I think actually the Buddha addressed this somewhat when he says that when people come to visit him, when bhikkhus, bhikkhunis, laymen, laywomen, people from other religions, etc., when they come to visit him, he gives them a talk which kind of relates to sending them away. So a good spiritual friend is not someone who you're kind of always hanging out with, ignoring your practice, not being alone, right? A good spiritual friend is someone who encourages you to be alone, someone who encourages you to develop tranquility, peace, meditation, someone who encourages you to develop virtue, encourages you to develop samadhi, encourages you to develop panya, encourages you in liberation, and encourages you in knowledge and vision of liberation. So a spiritual friend is not someone who distracts you, right, and hangs out with you, like kind of ignoring your spiritual practice. It's the opposite. So a worldly friend, even a friend who is kind of chatting about spiritual things, they are not a spiritual friend if they don't encourage, inspire, uplift, and enable you to practice, right? So if you're still working on developing your sila, a spiritual friend is someone who encourages you to develop sila. It's not someone who like you hang out at the ice cream parlor with talking about the precepts. It's someone who encourages you to develop the precepts and who, with that person's advice, with that person's example, you do follow the precepts. You do grow in sila. A spiritual friend is someone who encourages you to develop samadhi, not someone who just talks about it, but someone who gives you an example, gives you encouragement, gives you advice, such that you then go off and practice, right? So that's what a Kalyanamitta is. It's important not to confuse that, right? Kalyanamitta is not just like someone who is socializing with you. It's someone who is a good example, who actually encourages you to go and practice. That's why the Buddha says it's so important. Because if you're just by yourself, and by yourself, you don't have the motivation, the enthusiasm, and the energy to get out of your comfort zone, you need examples in your life who push you, who encourage you, who point out your weaknesses, who encourage your strengths, and who actually allow you to develop and grow. That's what a Kalyanamitta is. It's not just a friend, right? It's not just someone to hang out with. It's someone who actually makes you grow. That's why it's so beneficial, right, to have a friend like that. That's why the Buddha says it's so, so valuable. It's not because having friends is valuable. It's because we need people to push us, to encourage us. We need people as role models and examples. So the other thing to keep in mind is that Kalyanamitta is not just an equal. When the Buddha tells his attendant, Ananda, Kalyanamittata, spiritual friendship, is the whole of the spiritual life. It's the whole of the practice. The Buddha says in that same sutta that he gives, how is that, why is that so? Why is it true? What's an example of spiritual friendship being the whole of the practice? He says, well, the Buddha himself, if it wasn't for him, where would we be? So he's saying the Buddha himself is our Kalyanamitta. And the Buddha says to Ananda, he says to take the Buddha, take him as your spiritual friend. Take the Buddha as your Kalyanamitta. So see, the Buddha is not someone who you're going to be hanging out with, chatting around about random things. That's not, the Buddha wouldn't do that. The Buddha says in the sutta, when people come to talk to him, he actually encourages them to go off, to basically go and practice, not socializing. That's what it looks like to have a spiritual friend. So spiritual friend is not, it's someone who they allow you to grow. And that's why it's amazing, because sometimes we need people to grow, right? We need people to help us. We need role models. We need examples. And so that's why, for example, a teacher, someone who you consider your teacher, that would be a kalyanamitta. That would be called a kalyanamitta. So kalyanamitta is someone who helps us grow. Sometimes we might need, more company, and that will actually help us then go off and be alone. So, it's not just always being alone, right? Sometimes we do need to interact. But the point is that it's not the same as like enjoying company. It should lead you to being alone. So the difference is you can ask yourself, does this friendship, does this social engagement, does this socializing, does it lead to me wanting to then be alone? Does it lead to me being peaceful? Or does it lead to me wanting more socializing? Does it lead to me wanting more company? If it leads to wanting more company, it leads to entanglement. It doesn't lead to awakening. It doesn't lead to peace. It doesn't lead to freedom. If the talking, if the socializing, if the company, if the being in groups, if it leads to you then being more peaceful by yourself, being more mindful, practicing more meditation, being more virtuous, being more content, if it leads to that, then it is a spiritual friendship. It is kalyanamitta. So that's where the Buddha says, and we'll actually talk about this later in the sutta, the Buddha says there are some types of talking which that talking leads to entanglement, and you shouldn't engage in it. And there's other types of talking which leads to peace, and you should engage in that kind of talking. So yeah, that's the idea. And I hear the bell, so at this time I will have to close the live stream. But Sud, it looks like you have a good question. And so if you'd like to, Sud, you can put that in the monk chat, or you can put it in the next live stream for the next week on this sutta, and I'll get to that. So it's a very good question. Unfortunately, I just will have to go at this time. So sadhu to everyone. I hope that you have a wonderful practice, wonderful morning, and wonderful evening, whatever time it is where you are, wherever you are. May you be well, happy, peaceful. May your practice go well, and may you attain the supreme bliss of Nibbana. Sadhu.